our YouTube channel after the event. Also, every participant will receive a certificate of attendance. Please submit any questions you have in the chat box and we will answer these at the end of the session. Without further delay, I'm excited to hand over to Rachael, who's going to tell us about planning, prioritising and organisational skills for keeping on top of things. Over to you, Rachael. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, hi everyone. As Charlie said, my name's Rachael Roberts. I'm a teacher trainer and materials writer and the co-author of 2 levels of the new Pearson upper secondary series High Note. I'm also a qualified life coach, specialising in working with teachers and other educational professionals. So in this webinar, as the title says, I'm going to be talking about planning, prioritising and organising skills, primarily how we can help your students develop these, but I'm sure you'll also find some tips to help yourselves as well. So to start with, a little confession from me. Right, this is my desk. This is the desk that I'm sitting at the moment. And the one on the left is my desk when it's messy. And as you can see, when it's messy, it's really messy. And the one on the right is my desk when it's tidy. And probably some of you are thinking, that's really still not very tidy. So I'm showing you this because I want you to understand that I am not naturally a very organised, tidy, and neat sort of person. However, I have taught myself a lot about being more organised because I have discovered that this is very much the key to managing stress and managing life and work in general. So, to start with then, that's my desk too, says Tatiana. Yeah, well, you know, I'm being honest with you. So to start with, I'd like you to give yourselves a mark from 0 to 10, so 0 being low and 10 being high, as to how good you are at planning, prioritising and organising. So if you think you're brilliant, give yourself a 10. And if you think you're really dreadful, give yourself a 0. All right, so put the number in the chat box. Right, just let me have a look at what people think. Oh, we've got a 10 there. Good for you. Right, so it varies quite a lot, but you've got some idea, all right, of how organised you are. Let's just have a little quiz now to find out a bit more about your planning, prioritising and organising skills. All right, so here are some statements. So what I'd like you to do is to just, you can put it in the chat box if you want, or you can just write it down somewhere else, but write down the numbers of the statements which are true for you. So if it's true for you, put down those numbers. I'll give you a second to look at the statements. Okay, so I've had a chance to think about them now. All right, on the next slide, I've got the same statements, but I've put them into 2 categories. So if you put down numbers 1, 4, 6, and 7, then those are the more organised behaviours, if you like. If you put down 2, 3, 5, and 8, those are the less organised ways of behaving. So as I said to you at the start of the webinar, I think, you know, my tendency is, it's probably somewhere in the middle, but certainly I'm not right over on the left-hand side naturally. But I have taught myself, I think, to move further to the left. Because, you know, being disorganised, the truth is that being disorganised adds a lot to our stress. It makes life much harder. If you're disorganised, you're going to waste a lot of time looking for bits of paper, looking at the same thing several times. So getting organised can really help, I think, with saving time and also reducing that feeling of stress and overwhelm. And this is what we want to help our students to do, and also what we want to help ourselves to do. So Steve says, I find order in chaos. He's smiling. Yes, people sometimes do have this kind of almost like a pride in being disorganized, that it's creative and so on. I think there may be some truth in that, but it doesn't mean that it isn't stressful and that it doesn't waste time. Okay, so what about your students now? Now, obviously, you know, we're generalizing because all students are different. But on average, what kind of mark would you give them from 0 to 10? So pop that in the chat box. So this is a mark for your students now. Oh dear, Svetlana, yours sound difficult. 3 to 5, 3 to 4, 3, 5. So I think, yes, I mean, 8, good. But a lot of students struggle with this kind of thing. I think particularly teenagers. So, you know, let's look at how this impacts on people. Right, so this is not just about students, but it's partly about students. Here are some statistics about younger people and adults and the impact that being disorganized has. So have a look at these. Do any of these surprise you? Yes, you're saying they seem to struggle even with the very basic things. Yeah, well, and it's not just students, you know, it's adults as well. As we can see here, you know, apparently 23% of adults, I think this is in America, pay bills late and incur fees because they can't find their bills. Or this one in the bottom corner, nearly half of college students feel their high school didn't prepare them with the organisational skills they need to do well in college, and they would get better grades if they were organised. I think the one at the bottom left surprises me the most. Americans spend $2.7 billion a year replacing items they can't find in their own homes. Yeah, Kirsten makes a very good point here. Working online so much requires completely different organisational skills. I think that is absolutely true. Yes, totally. So we can see here that, you know, this is not just a sort of nice to have thing. Being disorganised and not planning and not prioritising causes huge problems for people, financial problems, as well as, you know, problems with their work. So no wonder really then that it's a key skill that employers look for when they're employing people. So we know that they're going to be more efficient, the quality of the work will be higher, it will be good for the reputation of the business if they have well-organised staff, and the opposite of course is true as well, you know, if they have to keep ringing up clients and saying they've lost bits of paper. And the workforce will be less stressed. Now, obviously, that's good for the workforce, but from the point of view of employers, that also means fewer sick days, which is obviously something that employers want, even if they don't care about whether the workforce is stressed or not. So you may feel with some justification that this isn't your job to teach your students these kinds of skills. You know, your English teachers. And yes, I can totally understand that. However, 3 things to think about. Firstly, somebody has to teach them these skills, and very often their parents are not going to be teaching them these skills. Maybe they don't have them themselves, maybe they're just too busy and working too hard. Secondly, a certain number of students will find these kinds of skills particularly difficult. Any students who are on the autistic spectrum, for example, are more likely to struggle with organisational skills, or students with ADHD and other kind of learning difficulties. So they need that support. And thirdly, if the first 2 points don't encourage you, it will make your life more difficult if your students are disorganised. And I think you already know that. They won't hand things in on time, they'll forget things, you know, and it makes it harder for you to keep on top of your work. So the first point is to help your students develop some systems. Now, somebody mentioned earlier, you know, that they just don't have quite basic skills. And I think this is because, you know, students, when they're younger, they just get told what to do by teachers, and they don't really have to organise themselves very well. The teacher manages everything. And then as they get older and they move up the school, they start having to take more responsibility themselves. And they're not necessarily going to know what to do if they haven't been taught, particularly if their parents haven't been teaching them. So students probably don't automatically know how to file things, for example. So if we're looking at paper, get them to write the date on the piece of paper and the subject so that they can file it afterwards. It's a very simple thing, but lots of students don't do it. Get them to use colour coding, for different subjects or for different aspects of subjects. And, you know, this, as somebody mentioned, this can be more challenging if you're working remotely because you're not actually getting to see their files. They're not bringing them into class. But you can take the opportunity to teach them some digital filing skills, such as how to file things in an online filing system like Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive. And what about to-do lists? So this is something I think that many people actually struggle with. So most people have some kind of to-do list system, but often it doesn't actually work very well. So people write things down in a list, but the list gets messy, or things just stay on that list for weeks on end and never get done. So it's about having a to-do list system that actually works and that we can actually trust with our information. So the trusting part is important because our brain hangs on to things that we haven't yet completed. Now, it doesn't always remind us at the time when we would want it to remind us, i.e. when we need it, but it will remind us at odd times like 4 o'clock in the morning when we wake up and go, oh, I've forgotten so-and-so. So this kind of hanging on to things that have not been completed is known as the Zeigarnik effect, and it's a key cause actually of stress for people. So one thing that can really help with that is to set up a trusted system that works where we can put our to-dos, and that's often referred to as a second brain because it's like a sort of reserve brain where we can put these things. So we're going to talk a bit about possible systems in a moment, but that idea of having a second brain, of having a reliable system that you can trust is a key, I think, in terms of the benefits of getting organised. So this is an example from High Note, which is the book that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And High Note has, one of its features is that every second unit there is a life skills lesson, and quite often these are career related skills, as it is here. And this is from High Note 2, and the lesson focuses specifically on time management. So students, you know, talk about the topic directly. And this is something that I think we can do to help them, as well as actually giving them techniques and modelling for them what we want them to do. We can actually get them to think about these topics directly. So in this lesson, they look at different students like them and the approaches that they use. And then they listen to an expert who gives them some tips about planning your time. So these tips about planning your time, I'm going to look at in a little bit more detail. So it's not incredibly clear, this slide, is it? But there are some points here. So be systematic, find time to plan every day. It only takes about 3 minutes. Be realistic, write down the tasks which you have the time and energy to complete. Break larger tasks into small parts, prioritise, decide which tasks are important or urgent. Plan some time to relax too, and tick off tasks when they're finished. So we're going to look at each of these now in a little bit more detail, because all of these are very important points. Oh, that's nice to know that you like the book. Thank you. So first point then, be systematic. and consistent. So in the same way that most of us at least have an unbreakable habit of cleaning our teeth every day, you know, we wouldn't dream of not doing it, we just do it automatically. We need to set up these kinds of organisational habits so that they are similarly consistent, so that it's something that we just get into the habit of doing. There is a tendency, a very natural human tendency, to start out with lots of enthusiasm on new systems and then give up. And we have this expression in English, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Do you have something similar in your language? So the idea being, you know, that we have these good intentions, we start out, but we never follow through with them, and so we end up in, you know, more of a mess than when we started, perhaps. So we can help students by reminding them and checking up, and we're going to look a little bit later at how we can help them to become more consistent and systematic. It's the same in Russian, is it? Yeah, and in Italy. I thought it might be one of those phrases that are in lots of different languages. So consistency, also being realistic. So by being realistic, what often happens with to-do lists, which I mentioned before, is that we have this enormous to-do list and we kind of expect that we're going to get through all of it. And of course we don't. And then we feel really overwhelmed and disappointed with ourselves. So one way of being realistic about our to-dos is to set ourselves a limit of how many tasks we're going to try to achieve. So this on the slide, and in fact you can see it behind me as well, although I've changed the organisation slightly, is a system that I use, which is based on a Japanese system called Kanban. And the idea is that you physically move your tasks here on the slide from the left to the right. And the ones in the middle are the ones that I'm currently working on. And you'll see that there are only 3 of them. So the idea is that you pick just 3 tasks that are your current focus. And until you have moved those to the right, you don't focus on anything else. So this idea of just having 3 tasks at a time really helps, I think, with overwhelm, and it makes it realistic and achievable. And yes, Rachel, that is my to-do list over my shoulder. I'm doing it horizontally now vertically now rather than horizontally, but it's the same thing. And you can see there are just 3 in the middle. So limiting the number of things that you do. Which brings me to prioritising. So I think prioritising is absolutely key. And this is something that most teenagers have absolutely no clue about how to do. You know, this is partly because of the way that the teenage brain is organised. It's still developing very fast and will continue to do so until they're in their mid-20s. And the last part of the brain to develop is that kind of logical frontal cortex part. So it's quite hard for teenagers, I think, to get organised because their brains aren't really working that way. And it's hard for them to prioritise as well. So, but this is something that we can teach them and that will help them to develop that faster. So we can explicitly teach students how to prioritise. And one way of doing this is taking a leaf out of Eisenhower's book. A very sort of quote that I like very much that he said is, "What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important." Right. So it's a you know, a bit of a sort of clever thing to say, but there's a lot of truth in this, that we tend to prioritize those things which appear urgent, and they are not necessarily the things that we should be prioritizing, or not always. So this is often represented in a 4-box matrix, like the one we have here. So this comes from Eisenhower's work, but it's based on the matrix. It's based on an idea in Stephen Covey's book. And the idea is that you put everything you have to do into one of these 4 boxes. So we have important and urgent. So that might be, an essay that has to be done by Friday, or a job offer that they have to respond to immediately. The one on the second box are the things which are important but not urgent. So that would be studying for end of term exams that are maybe weeks away. Exercising, I mean, that's rarely urgent, right? But it is important. The third one, not important but urgent. So the phone rings, that's urgent, right? But it's not necessarily important. And the fourth one, things that are not important and not urgent. Now, I'm not saying that you should never do any of those things, but they probably aren't going to be a priority. Now, what most people do is to spend most of their time in boxes 1 and 3. So they're always what we say in English, firefighting. So they're kind of dealing with emergencies all of the time. And that's very, very stressful. What Stephen Covey says is that we need to focus much more on box number 2. So box number 2 are those things which are coming up in maybe a few months' time, or which are lifelong habits like exercising. And we need to spend more time focusing on those. And if we spend more time in box 2, there will be fewer items in box 1, because things won't become urgent, because we'll have dealt with them in good time. So I think this is a really good way of looking at it. And this is something you can absolutely do with your students and get them to put the things they have to do into those boxes. And yes, Taya says we often tend to forget about number 2. Exactly. And that's where we should actually be focusing, perhaps most of our attention. So this is a very helpful way of understanding prioritizing. Another problem, I think, as students get older, is that the pieces of work that they have to do get bigger. And so, instead of just having a little bit of homework that takes, I'm just laughing because I saw Rachael saying a lot of people get stuck in box 4. Yes, I think that's true too. Instead of students having just, small pieces of homework that can be done in 30 minutes, they get given larger essays, they get given projects, they get given, revision tasks for a whole subject. And they start to feel that they're drowning in it, and they start to feel overwhelmed with them. So overwhelm can certainly be, a barrier for students, and indeed for us. So one way to deal with this is to encourage them to always break down bigger tasks into smaller tasks. And then it becomes more manageable, and then they can plan when they're going to do those smaller tasks. So here's an example from High Note, which is around writing. This is something that we probably more often do with writing essays, but you can see how it breaks it down. So they start by making an outline plan, then they make notes for each paragraph, then they think of a title, then they work on describing the performance, then they go back over it and think about engaging interest. So by giving sort of like step-by-step breakdown of the task, it becomes more manageable. So what else can get in the way of success for students? So we've talked about overwhelm and tasks being too big. Taya says procrastinating. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I was thinking about. Any other things that get in the way, do you think, for students or for you? Motivation, says Madge. Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few of these things. So the first one, I think, that often gets in the way, and this relates to what Rachael was saying about people getting stuck in box 4, distractions and interruptions. We all know that nowadays, it's harder than ever to avoid distractions. When I was at school, apart from the phone ringing, there weren't really that many opportunities to get distracted at home. Whereas now, students have got their mobiles, they've got notifications pinging all of the time, they've got people texting them, they've got, WhatsApp going off. So they've got hundreds of distractions and interruptions. And at some level, they probably quite like that, because it's, if you're a little bit worried about doing a task, it's quite nice to get distracted from it or interrupted from it. But we need to kind of not set ourselves up, if you like, for failure. And one way that we can do this is by consciously setting aside time to work on things when we're not going to be distracted. So this is sometimes referred to as monk mode, for obvious reasons, well, maybe not obvious to you, but monks are silent, aren't they? And they sort of go off into their little cells, their rooms, right, and talk to nobody. And that's what we want to encourage students to do at those times when they have to focus. So, you know, get them to switch off distractions, that if they need their phones on to research things, then at least turn off notifications. Secondly, Anna says, what's your opinion of Pomodoro? You're reading my mind, Anna. This, I think, is a really useful technique. I've taught it to my kids who are 15 and nearly 18 and both studying for exams this year, and it's helped both of them a lot. So the Pomodoro technique is the idea that you work for 25 minutes, absolutely uninterrupted, no stopping, no going to make a drink or anything. Then you take a 5-minute break, then you do another 25 minutes, 5-minute break. And then after 4 Pomodoros, which is the 25 minutes, you can take a longer break. But by that point, you've done 2 hours work. I find that this really works very well. I mean, it works well for me. I use it quite a lot. But it works very well, I think, for students, because they only have to focus for 25 minutes and that feels manageable. And actually, if you're really focused for 25 minutes, you can get an enormous amount done, much more than you might think. Because you're probably used to 25 minutes where you've been interrupted about 4 times. So, you know, I recommend that highly. Yes, Katarzyna says Pomodoro is great when you've got huge amounts of materials to revise. Absolutely, I totally agree. So the other thing I think that will help students in terms of sort of managing their time is to understand the planning fallacy. So the planning fallacy was something that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky came up with back in 1979, so it's not new. But here's a piece of research from 1994, which kind of shows you it in action. So they asked 37 students to estimate how long it would take them to finish their theses. And on average, they estimated between 27.4 days and 48.6 days. So worst and best scenario. And then the average actual completion time was 55.5 days. So almost all of them took a lot longer than they predicted. And that's the planning fallacy. We know from lots of research like this that we naturally, as humans, tend to be over-optimistic about how long things are going to take. And that then causes quite a lot of stress for people. So we can teach our students about the planning fallacy, and we can teach them to deliberately put in what I call cushion time. So cushion time is kind of like extra time that you think you're not going to need, but that you probably will. So if you think it's going to take you an hour to write that essay, allow yourself an hour and a half. And then you're not going to be putting yourself under too much pressure. And if you have extra time, you can always do something else with it. You can always check over it again or add in some more vocabulary or whatever. But teaching them about the planning fallacy and cushion time, I think, is a really useful thing for students to know. Okay, so this brings me now to procrastination, which somebody mentioned earlier. And this is, you know, a major problem, I think, for students and indeed for, you know, people in general. People often think that procrastination is about laziness. It's generally not. It's usually about emotions. very often procrastination is connected with some kind of anxiety. So it could be fear that we can't actually do the task, fear of failing the exam. It could be, anxiety about, how good what we're going to produce is. And so we tend to avoid it until we get to the point where we can't avoid it any longer, and then we do it. Now, to a degree, that can work for people. I know, lots of people who take that approach, professionals, and it does work to a degree because they produce good work on time, just about, but they've stayed up half the night to do it. It is, however, extremely stressful. And I think if we can help our students not to procrastinate, that's going to be of benefit to them. The clients that I speak to when I'm coaching, tell me that procrastination has been more of an issue for them this year. And I think this is because we're all generally more anxious this year, and therefore I think we're more likely to do that. Yes, Natty, I'm going to talk about that in a second, eat the frog. So, this is a problem for students. There's an analysis here which at the University of Calgary, which reported that 80 to 95% of college students procrastinate, and 50% said that they procrastinated consistently and problematically. So, this really is a problem, I think, for students, and something that we need to try and help them with. Here's a lesson, again, from High Note. This is from High Note 2. It's not a life skills lesson this time, it's a reading lesson. But the topic is about procrastination. And the speaking task associated with this looks at some different tips to help procrastinators. And it asks the students to grade them from most to least useful. So that's why there are ones there that perhaps wouldn't be the first thing you would do, like visitor psychologists, because it's most to least useful. But there are some there that you might not immediately see as useful, that actually are. And one of those is study with a friend. Now, obviously, this can be an excuse for students to mess about. I have a teenage daughter. I'm well aware of this. However, there is quite a lot of evidence that working with someone, or at least buddying up with someone so that you have accountability, really helps. So what this means is that two students kind of agree that they will check in on each other and see how they're progressing, or they agree that they are going to have completed a task by a certain point. And we know from research that this makes us much, much more likely to complete a task. And research into people exercising, for example, shows that exercising with a buddy and knowing that you have to turn up to go for that run together makes you much more likely to do it. So it's a good idea, I think, for students to set up study buddies. Secondly, and somebody mentioned this, the concept of eat that frog. So this comes from a book, and the book was based on a quote, and the quote was from Mark Twain, apparently, although I never know with these internet quotes. And he said, apparently, if it is your job to eat a frog, you had better do it first thing in the morning. And if it is your job to eat two frogs, then you should eat the biggest one first. Right, so the idea being that if you have something to do that you don't want to do, you should get into the habit of doing that thing first before you do anything else, and that will kind of force you to get through it. Somebody mentioned, yes, so Madge is saying motivation is our problem. I mean, I think that's true, but often I think that lack of motivation and procrastination, as I said, is about anxiety as much as anything. There's a kind of, if I don't try, I can't fail kind of thing going on. So it might be worth kind of thinking about it from that perspective, I think, when we're helping them. So the fifth point then, Plan time to relax. So this is going back to the time management points that we had from High Note. And this is really important. So very often when we're thinking about, managing our time and work, and we're only focused on the work time. But actually, if you don't plan in time to relax, and if you don't allow your students or your teenage children to have time to relax, they're not going to work as effectively. They're going to feel resentful about never having time to themselves. So it's important to plan that in. The Pomodoro system that we looked at actually builds that in with the 5-minute breaks. And it is important to take a break at that point, not to, just continue working or to, start flicking through your computer. Actually kind of getting up from the desk for 5 minutes makes a big difference. So the final item then on that list that we looked at is tick things off. So this is very satisfying, obviously, and it gives a sense of achievement, but checklists are also a very valuable tool. Another piece of research, this is quoted in Graham Alcott's book, How to Be a Knowledge Ninja, which I recommend. There's one especially for teenagers as well. So he talks about how a piece of research into surgeons using checklists with really quite simple things on, like wash hands, although I dare say nobody's forgetting to wash their hands at the moment. But even those simple things, having a checklist significantly reduced human error and saved lives. So having that kind of system can really help us, I think. And here's an example of how, we can use checklists in the classroom. So here's a checklist for how to take part in a debate. So the students use the checklist to look at how well they've done in the debate, but we can also get them to look at the checklist before they carry out the debate, and that will put it into their mind the things that they need to focus on. Okay, so finally then, final points. Oh, thank you, Tatiana. Final points. I think it's really helpful if you can get your students, and indeed yourself, I do this myself every Friday, to spend a little bit of time on a weekly review. So this could just be 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the week, thinking through these different aspects. So first of all, what's new? So what did you learn this week? Secondly, updating the second brain or the to-do list system that you're using. So what do you need to add to that? What have you actually done? What perhaps doesn't really need doing and can be, put down to the bottom of the list. Thirdly, thinking ahead. So what's happening next week? Am I prepared for it? What deadlines are coming up? And linked to that is this sort of practical preparedness. So that might be something like, I don't know, if you're going to be attending some online teaching, do you actually have an account with Zoom or whatever you're using? Do you know how to use it? So there's practical things. And then asking yourself some questions. So here are some examples of the kinds of questions that you might ask yourself in a weekly review. So things like, how well are my systems working? What can I or should I say no to? I'm not suggesting you encourage your students to say no to homework you set them, but they might say no to a social event, for example. What tasks am I resisting or avoiding? Am I looking after myself? What could I be doing differently? What can I learn from what happened this week? So just spending that little bit of time every Friday, looking back and looking forward, I think can really help to keep us focused and organised, and our students too. And you can then take this into a termly review. So they can look back at each weekly review and consider what went well, what they need to do differently, looking forward, what would a successful next term look like, which weeks are going to be busier or less busy, that can help them plan their time. What are the milestones coming up, like maybe mock exams? and how they can, achieve good work-life balance next term. So if we can teach them these kinds of habits, and if we can make them consistent, these are things they can take with them into their university life, into their working lives, and that will be, enormously influential and helpful for them. So just to finish up then, we know that this has been an incredibly difficult year. There are so many things that we can't control. There are so many things that just seem to happen and that we can't predict. However, there are lots of things that we actually can control, that we actually do have power over. And as Steve Maraboli says, incredible change happens in your life when you decide to take control over what you do have power over, instead of craving control over what you don't. So I hope you've taken away some useful tips there for you and for your students. We have a few minutes now where I can answer some questions, if that's helpful for people. Okay, so Tatiana says, what does it mean to update your second brain? So your second brain is like your to-do list, basically, or however you manage that. So it's second brain is where you put those things that you don't want to forget and that you need to do. So it's sort of updating that to-do list.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for delivering that. So yeah, guys, we've got a couple of minutes left for questions. So please let us know. Here we have one in. Rachel, where's it gone? Is there a method to filing that will make our job easier? Perhaps could you recommend a course or even some tools?
I think this is this is a great question. I think different things work for different people. So for me, this kind of system that I have, my to-do list system, for example, works very well for me. For other people, the idea of post-it notes would be a nightmare. So I think it's difficult to recommend one thing. I would certainly recommend the book that I mentioned on a few of those slides, The Knowledge Ninja, by Graham Alcott, because he has lots of different suggestions in there that you could try out and see which would work for you.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, we did actually have someone asking, is that your to-do list over your left shoulder?
Yes, it is. So you can see down here, these are the things that are coming up that I need to do in the next sort of few weeks. These are the ones I'm currently working on. It says there, practice webinar for Pearson. So that one will be moving up in a minute to the top, which are the things I have done.
And are the colours, do they signify anything?
No, I just like colour.
Okay, so you use like a height order for priority, and otherwise you your tasks together. Okay, well that's great. I mean, I use a program called Airtable, which is like an adaptive spreadsheet system like Excel. So you guys should check that out. Airtable. Another question here: what is the Japanese org technique called? Organisation technique. You referenced.
This is this. It's called Kanban. Kanban. I'll write it in the chat box. So the idea of Kanban is that you only focus on a limited number of things at one time, and then you kind of move things along like a production line.
Brilliant. And as it gets done, then it loses its place, and you move something into it. Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, and as it gets having like those great long lists, that you don't know where to start. So it's about prioritizing as well as.
I like to do a to-do list, and I prioritize, and I have big task, small task, and I'll always start with big task, and I'll treat myself with a small task. To do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good tip. I usually have, out of my 3, one of them is my MIT, or my most important task, and that's kind of the thing that has to get done. That day.
And then you treat yourself with a little juicy small task, for example. Exactly. Yeah. No, I like to do that as well, and that's how I guess this webinar series got pulled together with the team. Brilliant. Rachel, thank you so much for putting together those slides and for delivering your session. It was as always interesting and inspiring.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you all for attending.
Absolutely, and thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day. We've had somebody here very quickly. Title and author of book.
It's the Knowledge Ninja. Now I just said his name, and now I've completely forgotten it. Hang on, I'll go back to the slide. Graham Alcott.
There you go. So that's written at the bottom of this slide there. The Knowledge Ninja by Graham Alcott. Great.
Yeah, he actually has a version for teenagers as well that they can read themselves if anybody has a teenager.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure that there are. So that would be Graham Alcott's teenager tips of some sort. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Well, again, Rachel, thanks so much for this. And to the attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. Certificates will be sent out. Recordings will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And you will receive a virtual goodie bag where there are lots of useful links and further reading for you. Please do join us at more of our webinars. They're running till the end of tomorrow, but as you know, you can catch the recording on YouTube. We hope to see you there. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.